Good morning, good day, good afternoon, everyone.
Morning, good afternoon, David.
Hello. Thanks for joining to everybody. Our interactive webinar on engaging the private sector in national adaptation plans. We have 2 p.m. sharp. I would like to meet and start the meeting on the webinar on time because we have a full schedule for an hour and we want to leave sufficient time for the Q&A afterwards and to engage with you. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is David Ullman. I work for the UNFCCC Secretariat and I will be the moderator for today's session. The webinar will be undertaken by my colleagues from the NAP Global Network, Claire Church and Alec Crawford, and they will take you through this interactive webinar. And when I say interactive, it's not just a buzzword, it's really like you decide on which routes we take in this webinar. So first of all, I would like to give the floor to Cecilia Silva, the co-chair of the Adaptation Committee, for some welcoming words.
Thank you, David, for giving me the floor. Good morning. I think there is a feedback on the sound. David, can you hear? Someone is speaking.
Yes, we are finding out and muting.
No, we are fine. Thank you, David, once again for giving me the floor. And I would also like to thank all colleagues from the NAP GSP, NAP Global Network, who have worked together with us and making it possible. I would like to greet everyone participating, depending on the time zone you are. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We are happy to welcome all of you to this interactive webinar to launch the toolkit to more effectively engage the private sector in the process to formulate and implement national adaptation plans. First, I would like to thank again everyone who made it possible, who contributed to reviewing and validating its finding, and it goes especially to the NAP Global Network team. For those of you who are not familiar with the Adaptation Committee, the Adaptation Committee offers expert guidance that helps countries, civil society, and business to build resilience and adapt to the changing climate. It is the United Nations leading voice on adaptation, working to ensure that all bodies and organizations under the UN system work together to chart a path to a climate-resilient future. In the UNFCCC process, it is the primary body to ensure the coherence of adaptation actions and to raise the profile of adaptation. The Adaptation Committee has already held a series of events and workshops on the topic of private sector engagement in national adaptation planning. We saw great interest from governments to engage with the private sector in this process, but noticed that guidance on a transparent and hands-on way to do so was missing. So this toolkit has been prepared to fill this gap. It is a perfect example of how the Adaptation Committee leverages on the ground expertise by partners like the NAP Global Network to provide technical support to the parties. We are very happy to launch this toolkit today and encourage you and also please do not hesitate to contact the Secretariat if you have any questions about the Adaptation Committee and its work on private sector engagement and beyond. With this, I would like to hand back the floor to David and kick off this webinar and wish you all a fruitful webinar, and thank you all for participating once again. I would also like to let you know that due to agenda schedule of work, I will have to leave the webinar now, and we should have a very good participation. And David, I hand it to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia, for this opening remarks. Yeah, and also congratulations to you, because the scheduled conflict is actually the ceremony for promotion that Cecilia just received. So congratulations to that again.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you very much.
I would like to, before I go over and hand over to Alec and Claire, just to make you familiar with some rules here. So we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So I would like to ask you to not unmute yourself, to keep muted until the end. We'll have time to discuss afterwards. And if you want to take the floor or ask a question, you can either ask a question in the chat and we'll pick it up, or you can actually write your name. And with writing your name, you indicate that you want to take the floor and make an intervention. And then we have two colleagues who are taking care of any technical issues. I saw that some people have issues with the audio, so just don't hesitate to send an email, and we'll try our best to help sort that out. Thanks. And so I'm handing over to Alec and Claire to start the webinar. Over to you.
Thanks very much, David. So welcome, everyone. My name is Alec Crawford. I work with the NAP Global Network. I have the pleasure of taking you through the toolkit today with my colleague, Claire Church. We're very happy to be joining you all today, and thanks so much to all of you for taking the time to be part of this toolkit launch event. I know many of you are tired of being on webinars and on Zoom, but we really appreciate your time here today. So for those of you who are new to the NAP process, just briefly, it's a domestic process that integrates climate adaptation into development planning and budgeting at the national, sectoral, and subnational levels. We see that through the NAP process, though it remains a government-led and country-owned process, an effective NAP process is inclusive, it's participatory, and it really should involve a variety of stakeholder groups, including the private sector. So that's kind of what brings us here today. Who are we? The NAP Global Network, very briefly, is perhaps obviously a global network aimed at supporting and enhancing national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. We do this through a variety of means, including research, technical support to NAP teams, peer learning events and knowledge exchange, and a number of other activities that I won't dwell on here just because of the time that we have. But please do feel free to visit our website if you need more details. We're happy to engage with you. So the reason that we've come together today is the toolkit. We at the NAP Global Network work on a number of thematic areas, and one of them is private sector engagement. In 2019, so last year, we released a guidance document on why governments should be engaging the private sector in their NAP processes. This guidance document was developed in response to demand that we were seeing from countries in which we were working. So many NAP focal points were recognizing that the private sector could play a crucial role in some aspects of adaptation planning, financing, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. But they also realized that they needed further resources to support them in their efforts. So once we developed the guidance, and again, the guidance is available on our website at napglobalnetwork.org, we were very happy to partner with our friends at the Adaptation Committee on the development of a toolkit that really went into the details of how governments can practically engage with the private sector. And you've joined us today for the launch of that document. So the toolkit itself is designed to support country efforts to develop strategies that systematically engage the private sector in their NAP process as and when appropriate. We're not saying that the private sector needs to be involved across the entire NAP process, or that it's always needs to be at the table, but there are certainly moments when that is relevant and appropriate. We designed the toolkit to very much be complementary to the LEG technical guidelines for the NAP process, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So as you'll see today, it very much follows the same structure as those guidelines in terms of the 4 elements of those guidelines. The toolkit itself aims to, as I said, help governments leading domestic NAP process developing strategies for effective engagement of private sector actors. It's it's intended, we wrote it to be a guiding document and not be too prescriptive. So we recognize that what works in one context might not work in another context. And as such, you should really be adopting the methods and approaches that are most relevant to your national or local realities, or as we'll discuss today, the imagined realities of the fictitious country that we're going to be applying the toolkit to today. So why should the private sector be involved in the NAP process at all, you might be asking? Well, I think that by now there's a broad recognition that adapting to the impacts of climate change, whether it's at the national, subnational, or community level, is not going to be the responsibility of national governments alone. It's going to require coordinated input of multiple stakeholders. This includes local authorities, development partners, communities, civil society. But of course, businesses and investors also need to be involved. These are key engines of economic growth in developing countries. So the statistics say that we're talking about 60% of gross domestic product, 80% of capital flows, 90% of jobs. And here I'm not just talking about large multinational corporations, but also about micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. These are going to be crucial, particularly in developing countries. So we see that these actors will be relied on to create the jobs needed to support adaptation, to develop the products and services needed for societies to become more climate resilient, and to finance, either directly or indirectly, many adaptation actions. I'm getting a bit of feedback from somebody. Or if we can mute. Make sure everyone's muted. Thanks, that's great. We also see that the strategic and well-informed inclusion of private sector in climate change adaptation planning and actions should be a key part of countries' efforts to adapt to the impacts of climate change. They're going to be really key partners in the design, financing, and implementation of adaptation priorities. And I don't want to just stress the financing part. I think that there's much more to private sector engagement than just financing. So what's the business case for a private sector actor? If you're on the other side of this, how do you kind of make the business case for adaptation? Well, we see that the private sector, when they're deciding, whether to undertake or invest in any kind of action, whether it's adaptation or otherwise, they're typically going to be considering the business case. They're going to be looking at the expected risks and costs of action versus expected returns on a particular investment. This is, of course, going to be company and context specific. It's unlikely that any two companies will be considering the same risks and costs, even if they're in the same jurisdiction. But regardless, it's about risk and return. So with the private sector, it's often been difficult to make this case that they should be investing in adaptation. The risks associated with climate change may be unknown to them or poorly understood by investors. The cost of action may be too high. Returns on investment may be uncertain. Investments in current operations may take precedent over investments in minimizing any possible future risks. That's particularly pertinent right now, I think, in the midst of a pandemic. Adaptation options themselves may be unclear. And finally, indicators of success when it comes to adaptation may be difficult to define. Despite all this, we see that private sector investments in adaptation are starting to happen, and they're happening for four main reasons. So the first one is managing risks for business continuity. A lot of companies, I think, are recognizing that disruptions to a rail link, for example, destroyed by a flood, or a crop that's ravaged by a drought, this can cause a lot of harm to business operations. And as a result, companies, both large and small, are responding accordingly by investing in adaptation to plan for and mitigate these risks to ensure that their business operations and supply chains are safe, or at least more resilient. The second is capitalizing on new markets and business opportunities. Private sector actors may also invest in adaptation action to take advantage of new markets. They are motivated by profit, after all. And it's entirely possible that in a context of a changing climate, they can develop and distribute new goods and services that respond to local threats, and they can help people and communities while at the same time potentially making some money. The third is to strengthen reputation and brand value. So communicating investments and adaptation efforts to the public can help enhance a company's reputation in the eye of shareholders, customers, and particularly important now, I think, investors. Investors are now more willing, I think, to invest in those companies that are seen to be actively addressing and reducing their exposure to climate risks. And many investors are actually requiring disclosure of climate risks to shareholders and regulators. The final point that we see is one of compliance. So private sector actors simply complying with either the policies, regulations, and actions of governments, or, as I said, investors. Investors may be requiring that they start to think about how they can reduce their exposure to climate risk. So that's the kind of background on where the toolkit came from. And now, recognizing that many of you are undoubtedly suffering from Zoom fatigue, we wanted to move into a part of the webinar which really focuses on interactivity and engaging you as much as possible, given the limitations that we have of technology and not being able to present this to you in person. So as such, we'll be presenting you with a fictional country case study. And as a group, we'll be asking you to vote on how we can work our way through the toolkit. So you're going to be voting via Mentimeter, which some of you maybe have used before as the webinar proceeds. The hope is that this will give you at least an initial, if oversimplified, idea of how the toolkit can be used, but it's going to require a bit of technological input from you. So to help us through the process, my colleague, Catherine Burge, has just posted a link to the toolkit in the chat box. Please feel free to download that and follow along. If you're unable to access it through the chat box, you can find it at the top of our resource library, which is at napglobalnetwork.org/resources. But I would now ask you to all go to Menti, which is www.menti.com, using your phone or computer, and log in using the code 228131. That will allow us all to vote in the polls that will take us through the rest of the webinar. Very good. It looks like we're getting people signing up already. That's wonderful. We'll be in that for the next half hour or so. So thank you for visiting. As a bit of a roadmap, we'll be moving through all 4 stages of the NAP process during this exercise. Many of you will recognize these elements from the LEG technical guidelines. So we'll be moving from kind of element A and element B, the initial planning and preparatory elements, through implementation and then on to M&E. Again, we've designed the toolkit to try to align with these guidelines as much as possible. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to Saint-Geneviève. So Saint-Geneviève is our fictitious country. It's named after the patron saint of both disasters and Paris. So I think particularly relevant to climate. You are going to be asked to take on a role. You've just been hired as part of the government's NAP team, and you're going to be helping plan, implement, and monitor and evaluate the NAP process. So this is your colleague. She'll be coming along with you and posing important questions throughout the exercise. We have now prepared a brief video which we will present to you regarding the context of Saint-Geneviève, so you have a bit more background on our island. So that worked remarkably well, given our tests earlier, but I'm glad to see that that worked. So just as a recap for everyone, I know some of you have called in and are not online. Saint Geneviève is a small island developing state in the Caribbean. The majority of the population lives along the country's coasts, with the hilly, forested interior sparsely populated. It has a tropical climate. It's located within the Atlantic hurricane belt. Its key economic sectors are tourism, agriculture, and fisheries. Its key climate change impacts include increasingly intense and frequent tropical storms, flooding, landslides, sea level rise, coral bleaching, drought, and increasing temperatures. So that is our fictitious country. I hope the video worked for everyone. We're now going to get into the exercise. So it is your first day on the job, and you speak with the rest of the NAP team. They explain that they are in the early planning stages of the NAP process, having just completed an outline of their NAP a few months ago. They tell you that their NAP outline identified private sector engagement as a key priority. Although most of the NAP team is eager to begin their private sector engagement efforts, some members of the team believe it's too early in the NAP process to reach out to these stakeholders. So what do we do? I would ask you to go to Mentimeter and vote on the first question. Should we begin engaging the private sector? We've just launched the NAP process. Is that a yes or a no? So it looks as though the overwhelming majority of you think that now is indeed the time to engage with the private sector. So that's great. We'll click on the check mark there. So yes, as we see it, it's never too early to start considering private sector engagement, particularly in the planning stage. So I think we can now move on to the next phase of the exercise, and for that, I'm going to pass the floor on to my colleague Claire Church, who will take us through the rest of the story.
Great. Thank you so much, Alec, for giving us this context, the background, and then leading us into that adventure. And I'm very happy that there was a majority that said we should choose to engage the private sector. Otherwise, this would have been a very short webinar. So, all right, we'll get into it, though. So as a first step, the NAP team has decided to conduct an analysis of the private sector. This will ensure that there's a sufficient understanding among the team of the country's private sector context and how they can be engaged in adaptation planning. You turn to Section 3, Element A of the toolkit, and think that the stakeholder mapping exercise would be a good start to identify and analyze the island's private sector actors. Working with your team, you map out stakeholders based on their influence within the private sector and their interest in the NAP process. Here's what you find. So as you can see here, the St. Genevieve Hotels Owner Association has both high influence in the private sector and high interest in the NAP process. Conversely, the Dental Association of St. Genevieve has low influence in the private sector and low interest in the NAP process. The National Bankers Association has high influence in the private sector and low interest in the NAP process. And the Banana Growers Union has low influence in the private sector, but is generally very interested in what's going on with the NAP process. So you present these findings to the NAP team, and they explain to you that they already have a very strong relationship with the St. Genevieve Hotel Owners Association, and you can easily call on them for future engagement efforts. Though they plan to eventually engage with each of these private sector actors, they must now prioritize one in addition to the Hotel Owners Association to target next for engagement efforts. Which private sector actor should you choose to engage next? The National Bankers Association, the Banana Growers Union, or the Dental Association of St. Genevieve? So I'll give everyone a few minutes or a few seconds to vote here. Ooh. It's a tight race, wow. All right. So I think the bankers have it by a small margin. So we'll go with that. But the banana growers were a close second. All right, so we will choose to engage the National Bankers Association. Fantastic. You decide to target the Bankers Association next with engagement efforts in the NAP process. You turn to page 22 of the toolkit for tips on how to establish contact and communication with them, and decide to use the following techniques. Be strategic, speak the language of the private sector, and identify entry points of leverage. In this case, using these strategies may mean establishing contact through the Vice President's office to identify the best contact in the association to participate in government consultations. Using economic and financial data on adaptation in your key messaging may also help make the case for why adaptation matters for the Bankers Association. It might also be helpful to point to examples of banks getting involved in climate change adaptation at the regional and international levels. You and your NAP team decide to use these communication techniques. Time passes and the Bankers Association starts to spread the word to its networks about the NAP process. A chain of restaurants that does its financing through the association reaches out to your NAP team and wants to learn more about how they can get involved in the NAP process. So now you and your NAP team have a solid understanding of the private sector context in St. Genevieve, and you have begun to establish contact and communication with some of the prioritized private sector actors. You now suggest to the team that it's time to start to focus on addressing some of the key enabling conditions for private sector engagement. You point to page 19 in the toolkit, which identifies ways to do this. You share with the team that there are 4 key enabling conditions to encourage and facilitate private sector engagement in the NAP process: information sharing, financing, institutional arrangements, and capacity building. Ensuring each of these enabling conditions are in place will require considerable time, resources, and political will, but doing so will encourage private sector engagement throughout the entire NAP process. You suggest taking an approach to the enabling conditions that is tailored to the results of the private sector context analysis. You begin to hold consultation meetings with members of the private sector to understand their needs, capacities, and opportunities for engagement. In a consultation meeting with the Hotel Owners Association, you ask them what they have been the barriers to their engagement in the NAP process so far. They answer that they don't know how to adapt to climate change, and they explain that they are also unsure if they have the technical capacities to do so. Given this information, which enabling factor should your NAP team focus on first, information sharing or capacity building? So if you want to go into Mentimeter now and take a vote there about which enabling factor we should do. All right, thank you everyone for voting. It looks like we've got a majority here with information sharing. So we'll target that enabling factor. So you and your NAP team decide to focus on information sharing first. You turn to page 24 in the toolkit to look at ways to do so. Your team begins to publicize and promote resources about how climate change will fundamentally alter the economy, the risks of inaction, and the opportunities that could emerge as a result of climate change. Your team also begins to disseminate best practices in adaptation action, highlighting lessons from past adaptation actions and programs, both good and bad. The Hotel Owners Association now has a better understanding of how to adapt. They decide to first disseminate information to their members on best practices in stormproofing their buildings and structures on site. Congratulations, everyone. So, 1 year now passes. Based on your exchanges with the private sector in the planning phase, your NAP team has built up a solid relationship with the country's most important players in the private sector. Now, the St. Genevieve NAP team has entered into its implementation phase of the NAP process and has a clear idea of how the country's private sector can support the NAP process. Unfortunately, some private sector actors were not engaged in the early phases of the planning process, including Snapperfish, a medium-sized fishing company. Snapperfish is a key employer in the fisheries sector and can act as a private sector champion for the NAP process if they are engaged. Moreover, the profits of Snapperfish have plummeted recently due to the impacts of climate change. Increasing storm intensity has been hard on their small fishing vessels, limiting how often they can go out. Increasing storm severity has also caused much of their gear, including their traps, to be lost at sea. Ideally, Snapperfish would have been engaged in the early stages of the NAP process, but they weren't. Your team decides to use the implementation phase of the NAP process as an opportunity to engage more private sector actors, including Snapperfish. This could hopefully ensure their continued engagement in later M&E phases. You turn to Section 3, Element C of the Toolkit on implementation and see if there are any opportunities to support private sector implementation of the NAP process. You see a few opportunities that could work for Snapperfish, including working with the company to identify opportunities to climate-proof their business, or working with the company to identify opportunities to develop and distribute climate-resilient goods and services for the rest of the fishing community. Which should you choose? So we'll go back into Mentimeter. Should we try to identify opportunities to develop goods and services for Snapperfish, or identify opportunities to climate-proof their business? Give you guys a few seconds. All right, fantastic. It looks like we have a majority here with identify opportunities to climate-proof their business. Thank you everyone for voting. All right, so you turn to page 33 of the toolkit and you get to work. Your team works with Snapperfish to identify a list of opportunities for them to climate-proof their business. These opportunities include improving onshore storage facilities for boats and gear that can prevent loss or damage from storms, as well as investing in larger fishing vessels that could fish during the storm season. Both could potentially improve their profits while contributing to adaptation efforts. Ultimately, Snapperfish decides to develop a financing proposal for 2 larger fishing vessels to be used during the storm season. They are now officially engaged in the NAP process and are beginning to encourage others in the sector to get involved. Great job, team. 2 more years pass, and the NAP process implementation is well underway. The hotel owners, fishers, and others have all been active advocates for the NAP process and have implemented and even financed many of your NAP team's identified adaptation options. To ensure that the NAP process continues to be iterative, you suggest to the rest of the team that they start to work on monitoring and evaluating progress to date. You turn to Section 3, Element D of the toolkit. While private sector engagement has been so far successful, you decide to evaluate your engagement efforts to account for gaps, successes, and lessons learned. You look in the toolkit for guidance on how to review and assess private sector engagement. Using the evaluation provided, you note important information about ongoing private sector engagement, which institutional arrangements were used, for example, or when the private sector actors were engaged, and the characteristics of the private sector actors themselves. You soon discover a key gap in your engagement efforts. Though a mix of enterprises and financiers have been engaged at varying stages of the NAP process, you notice that women-led and women-focused businesses are underrepresented. Given that the NAP process aims to be gender responsive, you know that this is an imbalance in representation that needs to be addressed. But admitting that there's a gap in your private sector engagement efforts could reflect poorly on you. What do? Do you address the gap in the NAP process and share your lessons learned? Do you address the gap in the NAP process but keep the information to yourself, or do you ignore it altogether? So we'll vote in Mentimeter. Okay, great. I think we have a majority there. I think it's safe to say. So we will address the gap and share lessons learned. Great. So you tell the rest of your team about the gap in private sector engagement efforts. They thank you for your update and work tirelessly to actively engage more women-led and women-focused businesses in the NAP process. Your team then works to communicate this gap, but also your successes and lessons learned to the public and key members of the private sector. This facilitates a crowding in of new actors as they see the business case for engaging in the NAP process. It also generates public reputational benefits for those already involved in the NAP process, resulting in their sustained engagement. So congratulations, everyone. You've led St. Genevieve to a pretty successful NAP process, I think I can say. And though we recognize that this is a very simplified version of how the toolkit could be used, we hope that that exercise sort of demonstrated that the findings of the toolkit can be applied in ways that are both practical and flexible to the given context, whether you're engaging the dentists or the banana growers. If you'd like to learn more, as always, we encourage you to look at the toolkit itself. The link is up on the screen right now, napglobalnetwork.org/resources. Or you're welcome as well to reach out to us. We'll provide context on the last slide. But thank you so much for your participation, and we hope you come back to St. Genevieve soon. But for now, we'll pass it back to David to guide us through the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Great, thanks a lot. That was amazing, and it worked well. We already got comment that it cured the webinar fatigue, and I agree. So it was really interactive. Before we go over to the Q&A session, I would just like to say, responding to some of the questions, yes, we can share the slide. Yes, the recording will be available afterwards for you also to share with your colleagues. Also for your ease, in the invite, there's also a link to the event website on the UNFCCC website, and from there on the tool is also linked. So you don't need to, I mean, that's also an easy way to get there. And we are happy if you fetch it from any of the sites or any of the resources available and share it widely. I think we can start with the questions. So I'm going from the most recent, from the latest one, and I think it would be great if our presenters would show their faces for the Q&A. So I'm talking, so you can see the face where they're answering. Excellent. Hello, Alec. So question, so two questions. No, one we already replied to. So one is, will COVID-19 make it hard to engage private sector in NAP processes, having already problems to recover from the crisis? And the other one was on how to basically how to be strategic for the banks or for the NAP. That was, I think, pretty much related to your part, Claire. So these two questions, I think Alec wanted to take the first one, and Claire can take the second one. And then in the meantime, you can ask more questions. And I see another question, if we can share the slides. Yes, we will share the slides, the toolkit, and the video afterwards in a follow-up email. If you want to ask any question afterwards, you can just write your question here in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand or write your name in the chat if you want to take the floor. So over to you, Alec and Claire.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks everyone again for joining us and for the questions that are starting to come in, and for bearing with us as we tried something a little bit different from the typical webinar. I just wanted to reiterate before getting to the questions that the toolkit itself isn't coming out of nowhere. It's also coming out of engagement that we've had with a few countries already, specifically St. Lucia, Ghana, and Vietnam, where they have, we've worked with them to support the development of private sector engagement strategies specific to their NAP process. And out of those experiences and out of what we're seeing on the ground, that's where much of the content comes from for this toolkit. So just to reassure everyone that it has kind of been field tested to an extent, but of course we would welcome more countries and more governments taking this on to see if they can, if they find it useful, and if they can in turn kind of develop ways of engaging private sector actors. On the question of COVID, I think it's a very, very interesting one, and there's certainly truth in the fact that the pandemic has changed so much and will of course make engagement different than it was 6 months ago. But at the same time, I think that the NAP process offers us a kind of unique opportunity or a unique mechanism to engage with those private sector actors. And I'll explain why. I think the NAP itself is in large part about identifying risks and vulnerabilities. And while those risks are typically climate focused, I think that there's certainly, the pandemic has laid bare that there's certainly an overlap between the risks and vulnerabilities that countries are exposed to as a result of climate change and the risks and vulnerabilities they were exposed to as a result of the pandemic. There's an overlap there. So I think that the NAP process, and the NAP Global Network has stated this before, does offer an opportunity or a unique mechanism by which governments can start thinking more holistically about their risks and planning on how they integrate increased resilience and those risks into their medium and long-term development priorities. For COVID, for the recovery from the pandemic, once we kind of fully get to that point, I think that it's no surprise or no secret that there's going to be a required massive investment, both public and private, in green and resilient recovery means, so that we can build back better and be more prepared for the next catastrophe, whether it's health related or climate related. And I think that because you're going to see quite a bit of money coming from the public sector and from donors and from other sources into that recovery, it does offer a kind of unique opportunity for the private sector to be engaged through things like public-private partnerships.
I think we have lost Alec. I can only see the frozen picture. Let's wait for 1 second if he's coming back soon. Probably some internet connectivity issues. Otherwise, back to, I think we can now take Claire, go to Claire for the question, and then we can go back to Alec when he is back with us.
Yeah, sure. So I'll let him answer when he's back, because I'm sure he'll be able to connect back soon. But on the question about how to be strategic in engaging the bankers, so of course this is context specific, and we had a fictitious context, but in general we kind of in the toolkit will outline strategies to be strategic, to speak the language of the private sector, and to identify entry points of leverage when you're establishing contact and communication with the private sector. So in this case, with bankers especially, this might mean establishing contact through their vice president's office. and identifying through that office who's the best person to contact on this. It might mean as well that in your key messaging, you're using financial and economic data so that you're really underlining the business case of why adaptation matters. It also might be useful in these contexts to point to other banking associations, either at the regional level or even at the international level, that have been engaged in climate change adaptation, and pointing to these as examples to lead from. So these are just a few ways that you could be strategic in engaging bankers, but in general, they can be really great private sector champions. So engaging them is key for sure. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And until Alec is back, I'll just take the opportunity to add from our side. So we have the next 2 or 3 questions that I'm now reading out that we are now tackling, and also we'll add some reflection there until Alec is back, so that Claire doesn't have to bear the whole responsibility herself and not throwing all the questions to her. Claire, I'm sending, there's one question that's directed to you that you can already prepare, answering how many language countries have the toolkit been translated to and used in. And in the meantime, I'll be also tackling the question, could we use or remodel the toolkit for other scales? For example, watershed, village, provincial. Just want to say that this is a NAP supplementary guideline. So I'll share with you the link. Probably my colleagues can look it up and share it in the chat with you. We have a lot of NAP supplementary guidelines that are, not necessarily all from the NAP Global Network. They have a lot of resources, but also in the NAP Central, you'll find a lot of supplementary guidelines on a specific sector specific or approach specific toolkits and guidelines for example, for health, ecosystems, cities. To have on indigenous and traditional knowledge. So all of these you will find on in the NAP Central, and my colleagues can post the link here. So I'll go. Thanks. 2 colleagues have been attentive, so you can see the link there. So back to Claire on the question on the translations and the countries this has been used in. Note that this is actually today the launch of the toolkit, so Claire will most probably be able to respond in terms of their other activities and also probably the plans.
Yes. So, and Christian's on the line as well. So Christian, correct me if I'm wrong here. But we are launching the toolkit today officially in English, but we have plans, I believe, to translate it into French and Spanish. So that will come out shortly. But yeah, Christian, let me know if that's wrong.
So we'll not let Christian intervene here. So we'll just take that for granted now. 2 questions now for you, Claire and Alec. Does the toolkit suggest the countries a way to conduct stakeholder analysis without relying on external international consultants? And how do we change the mindset of certain countries that only have the thinking that the private sector is only to assist financially when the private sector can contribute beyond that? And the engagement of the private sector is usually, so that's another question here. So I raised to 3 questions. The third question is engagement of private sector is usually dependent on the sector expectation of business opportunities or profit making of such a practice. How can this be addressed? So did you catch that, or should I repeat once again?
I think we got them. You okay, Claire?
Yeah, I'll let you take these ones.
Take all 3 of them. So the last one, I think, on the profit motivation, I think that there is an argument that can be made, a strong argument that can be made by governments to private sector actors that these investments make sense from a business standpoint. I tried to outline that in the slide on the business case for it, but essentially, I think when profit is profit is the motivation, I think you can talk to them about both protecting their operations and ensuring that climate change doesn't disrupt their supply chains or their operations. So there's kind of the expenses side of the profit equation. And then on the other side of it, I think that you can ensure or assure them that there are, potentially opportunities within climate change adaptation for increasing profit through the provision of new goods and services to the public. So I think that you can make the case to the private sector that both are kind of relevant ways of looking at the profit motivation. The other thing to keep in mind, and this might apply more to developed context than developing context, but I think that you'll see it spreading, is that the investors are increasingly asking for this, and they're asking for it because their shareholders are asking for it. So if investors are increasingly saying you're going to have to disclose your exposure to climate risks, and you're going to have to work to minimize those climate risks, you're going to see particularly larger companies start to do so in order to remain a viable investment for large investors. It's tougher for the small and medium-sized enterprises. They often just don't have the resources to make these kinds of investments. And I think that that's where a lot of the work is going to have to come from developing countries. And one way to try to reach those actors is through what are called, business multipliers or business associations. So instead of directly engaging with the local brewery or, Coca-Cola, you're going through something like, as we had in the case study, the Banana Growers Union or the Dental Association or the Hotel Owners Association. So you're trying to use those actors to then feed information about climate change and the urgency of investing in adaptation to their members. And potentially skills and training and all kinds of things can go through those associations. So they're an important actor to try to engage with when you're working with the private sector and trying to convince them that there is a business case for making these investments. The first question was on international consultants, and I hope that we've designed the toolkit in such a way that it can be done by the NAP team. That, of course, depends on the resources and the manpower, womanpower that is available within those teams. But we don't write the toolkit this process to hire it to do the work. It's very much geared towards the teams themselves. At work in a way that is hopefully as practical and low resource as possible. It's entirely realistic that some donor support might be required and some external expertise may be required, but I think that there are certainly things that NAP teams can do to start, and they're better placed to do it than international consultants, to be honest with you. When you're doing at the outset of this process a mapping exercise on who the private sector is within your country, that's something that you're uniquely well placed to do, rather than flying somebody in from another country. So I think that the toolkit we explicitly designed it or intentionally designed it to be applied by the teams themselves and by the governments themselves. As I said, support might be needed, but hopefully they can use the toolkit in the best way they can. What was the second question again, David?
There was a second question about how do we change the mindset of certain countries that only have the thinking that the private sector is only to assist financially when the private sector can contribute beyond that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and it's one that we came across a lot in the research, and one that we tried to address in the toolkit and in the guidance note that led into the toolkit. So I would encourage you to read both those. I think that that mindset has to be broken. I think governments, they can't just see the private sector as a bag of money that will help them finance adaptation actions. They have to be seen as, and where appropriate, as partners in planning and implementation. So I think that the private sector will be much more receptive to engaging in the private sector if they see themselves as more than just a financing opportunity. If they see themselves as a partner in generating the jobs, creating the jobs that are needed for a society to become more resilient, in the goods and services that are required for that resilience to be increased, the inputs into that process. If they see themselves as potentially a provider of, let's say, climate information, if they're an agricultural company, or part of the monitoring and evaluation system that's put in place, I think that you really want to make the case that their involvement has to be much broader than simply financing.